Imagine this. You're alone in a dark room staring at a screen. Your heart races. You tell yourself just one more time. But deep down, you know the truth. You're trapped. At first, it felt harmless, just a curiosity, a way to escape stress. But now it's something else. It's heavier, darker. It follows you everywhere. No matter how hard you try to push it away, it always finds a way back. And with every passing day, you feel the grip tightening around you. You've tried to stop. You've told yourself this is the last time. You've made promises, to yourself, to God. But no matter how strong your resolve, the cycle continues. A moment of weakness, a moment of surrender. And just like that, you're back to where you started. But have you ever asked yourself, what is this really doing to me? At first, it's invisible. It creeps in silently like a shadow in the night. It numbs you. It changes the way you see the world, the way you see people, even the way you see yourself. And before you know it, something inside you starts to wither away. You feel distant from your loved ones, from your faith, from your purpose. Your prayers feel empty. The fire inside you grows dim. The things that once brought you joy now feel hollow. You're not the same person you used to be. And the worst part? No one sees it. No one knows the battle raging inside you. On the outside, you look fine, you smile, you laugh, you go about your day. But deep down something is broken, and you don't know how to fix it. But what if I told you that there is a way out? That the weight you're carrying, the guilt, the shame, the secret that keeps you up at night, it can all be lifted? That you don't have to live like this? That there is a way to break free permanently? And more importantly, what if I told you that this isn't just a bad habit? That this isn't just a personal struggle? What if I told you that this is something much, much more dangerous? Padre Pio warned about this very thing. He called it a trap set by the enemy, a force that consumes the soul and destroys everything in its path. And the Bible? It gives us the chilling truth about its consequences, truths that most people ignore until it's too late. This error can be fatal, but here's the good news. There is a way out, and in the next few minutes, you're going to discover how. You're going to see the devastating effects that this hidden struggle has on your life, on your soul, and on your destiny. But more importantly, you're going to learn how to break free, once and for all. So stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear could change everything. And before we continue, if you're ready to step into a life of freedom, if you want to receive more eye-opening insights like this, make sure you subscribe right now. This is just the beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. James never thought this would happen to him. He was a man of faith, devoted to God, striving to be the best husband, father, and disciple he could be. He prayed daily, attended Mass, and confessed regularly. To everyone who knew him, he was a man of integrity. But behind closed doors, a hidden battle was brewing, a battle he never saw coming. A battle that almost destroyed him. It all started on an ordinary evening. James had just finished a long day of work, exhausted from the demands of life. His wife was asleep, the house was silent, and he found himself mindlessly scrolling on his phone. It wasn't intentional, just a moment of curiosity. A simple click. Nothing dangerous, nothing serious. But that one click led to another, and another. At first, it felt harmless. He told himself, everyone does it. He wasn't actually hurting anyone. It was just a way to relax, a way to escape stress. He wasn't committing any real sin, right? Or so he thought. The next night, he found himself in the same place. Again, and again. What started as occasional became frequent. What seemed innocent became something he needed. It was as if something had latched onto his mind, whispering, just one more time. It won't hurt. You can stop whenever you want. But James never stopped. Something inside him changed. At first, he didn't even notice. But little by little, it began to show. He became more distant from his wife, more impatient with his children. Prayers that once filled his soul with peace now felt empty. His time with God became shorter. His confessions felt repetitive. Then came the guilt. Every time he gave in, a wave of regret would hit him like a storm. He promised himself, never again. He prayed, asking God for strength. But then, just a few days later, the urge returned, stronger than before. And each time he failed, the guilt deepened. It was no longer just a habit. It was a chain wrapped around his soul. James began to justify his actions. At least I'm not committing a real sin. At least I'm not hurting anyone. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was losing control. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. James was no longer the same man. His heart felt distant from God, his mind clouded by thoughts he couldn't control. He tried to suppress it, to ignore the voice in his head. But something inside him whispered, "This is not who you are meant to be." And then, something happened that changed everything. One night, as James sat alone, his mind racing with conflict, he stumbled upon the words of Padre Pio. It wasn't planned, just a random video that appeared on his screen. But the words pierced through him like a sword. Every sin, every impurity, leaves a mark on the soul. It dulls the heart, silences the conscience, and separates man from his creator. And if you do not fight it, it will consume you completely. James felt his entire body freeze. He had never thought of it this way. He had never considered that his choices weren't just affecting his emotions, they were affecting his very soul. What if he was already being consumed? For the first time, fear gripped his heart. He realized this wasn't just about him. It was about his marriage, his family, his faith, his eternity. James had to make a choice. He could continue down this path, pretending everything was fine, or he could face the truth, that he was in a battle far greater than he ever imagined. And battles must be fought, but could he win? Could he truly break free from this? The answer would change his life forever. What do you think? Have you ever felt trapped by something you once thought was harmless? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your experiences. And if you want to break free and step into the life God has called you to live, make sure to subscribe right now. This journey is just beginning, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and let's uncover the truth together. Now, let's continue. Because James's battle has only just begun. James never thought it would come to this. At first, he believed he was in control. He convinced himself that his habit was just a small indulgence, something that had no real consequences. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, his life started to change. It began with his wife. He still loved her, of course. He still admired the way she cared for their home, the way she spoke with kindness, the way she always put their family first. But something was different. His eyes didn't light up when she entered the room like they used to. The warmth in his heart, the spark, the admiration, it had faded. He didn't understand why. He told himself it was normal, that maybe marriage just loses its excitement over time. But deep down, there was a whisper in his soul, telling him that something was wrong. That whisper became a scream the day he caught himself comparing her to the unrealistic images he had been feeding his mind. He noticed it in small moments. The way his patience had thinned. The way he felt more irritated by the smallest things. Her laugh, her stories, the way she tried to connect with him. He began avoiding deep conversations, keeping himself distracted, making excuses for why he didn't feel like being close to her. And then came the nights of silence. They used to lay in bed together, talking about their days, their dreams, their faith. Now James stared at the ceiling, lost in his own world. His wife felt the distance, but she didn't know why. She tried to reach for his hand, to bring back the warmth between them, but he would subtly pull away, pretending not to notice. She didn't deserve this. And yet James didn't know how to stop. Then came the guilt. Every Sunday, James sat in church, surrounded by people singing praises to God, but he couldn't lift his voice. The words felt hollow, Every time the priest spoke of purity, holiness, and the presence of God, James felt a weight pressing down on him. He knew what he had to do. He needed to confess. But the shame was unbearable. How could he say it out loud? How could he look a priest in the eye and admit that his mind was polluted? That he had let something so dark take hold of him? So he stayed silent. Weeks passed, then months. His heart grew colder. Prayers became lifeless, as if they were just empty words. He tried to repent in secret, promising himself that he would stop, this time for real. But the temptation always returned, stronger than before. The worst part? He no longer recognized himself. James used to be a man of faith, a man who inspired others, a man who felt close to God. But now, he felt like a stranger, even in his own skin. His thoughts were no longer his own. Every conversation, every moment of stillness, every time he closed his eyes, his mind was flooded with images he didn't want to see. He couldn't focus in prayer. Every attempt to reach for God was met with distractions, a battle raging in his head, and the emptiness. The emptiness was the worst part of all. It felt like a hole inside him, growing deeper each day. The temporary pleasure never lasted. The moment it was over, it vanished, leaving only guilt, regret, and the sickening knowledge that he had lost another battle. And with each loss, his soul grew weaker. One night, as he sat in the darkness of his room, staring blankly at the wall, the weight of it all came crashing down. He felt exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually. He felt as if something inside him was withering away, as if his very soul was slipping through his fingers. And then, the realization hit him like lightning. This wasn't just about his habits. This was about who he was becoming. For the first time, he understood. He was losing himself. He thought back to the words of Padre Pio. Sin doesn't just stain the soul, it suffocates it. It makes you unrecognizable even to yourself. James had reached a turning point. He could continue down this road, allowing his soul to be consumed, or he could fight. But was it too late? Could he truly break free? Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "You are not beyond saving, but you must act before it's too late." Now, let me ask you, have you ever felt like something was pulling you further and further away from God, even when you wanted to do the right thing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who feels trapped, and if you're ready to start breaking free, make sure to subscribe right now. This journey isn't over, and the next step is one you can't afford to miss. Now, let's continue, because the battle for James's soul has only just begun. James sat in the darkness of his bedroom, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a heavy burden. The faint glow of his phone screen illuminated the room as he absent-mindedly scrolled through social media, trying to drown out the thoughts racing through his mind. He had tried everything to stop. Promises, prayers, resolutions. But nothing worked. He could feel it. The gnawing emptiness inside him, the insatiable hunger for something more that he couldn't quite place. His heart had grown cold. The connection he once had with God, with his wife, with his own sense of purpose, was slipping away. It was like being caught in a dark, endless tunnel with no way out. But then, something caught his eye. A video popped up on his feed. It wasn't anything he had been looking for, but the title grabbed his attention.
Padre Pio, The Destructive Effects of Sin and the Path to Redemption. He had heard of Padre Pio. He knew he was a saint, someone revered for his deep spirituality and miraculous gifts. But what did he have to say about a struggle like this?
James clicked on the video, desperate for something, anything, that might make sense of the chaos he was feeling inside. As the video started, Padre Pio's voice, calm and steady, filled the room. "My dear children, beware. There are sins that don't just harm the body. They destroy the soul. They pull you away from God and lead you straight to the gates of hell." James felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard people talk about hell before, but this was different. There was an urgency in Padre Pio's voice, a conviction that James couldn't ignore. The words weren't just meant for others. They felt like they were meant for him personally. The sin of impurity is one such sin, Padre Pio continued. It doesn't merely stain the soul. It chains you, trapping you in a prison of your own desires. It opens the door for the enemy to enter and take control of your heart. When you engage in this sin, you are not just making a mistake. You are making a pact with darkness. And the longer you allow it, the more it will consume you. James's heart skipped a beat. He sat up straighter, his mind racing. Is this what I've been doing? The weight of the saint's words hit him like a thunderclap. He wasn't just fighting against a habit, against something that could be dismissed with a few well-intentioned resolutions. No, he was engaged in a spiritual war, a battle that had far greater consequences than he had ever imagined. Padre Pio's words were like a mirror reflecting the truth he had been avoiding. Every time he indulged in his addiction, every time he gave in, he wasn't just weakening himself. He was opening the door to his soul, allowing the enemy to step in and take control. He could feel it now, the darkness that had slowly, insidiously crept into his life. The guilt, the shame, the sense of powerlessness. Sin will blind you, Padre Pio's voice echoed in the video. It will make you believe you are in control, but you will be a slave to your desires, to your weakness, to the lies the enemy feeds you. And when you finally wake up, you will find yourself lost, far from God, far from the peace you once had. James's stomach churned. Lost. That's how he felt. Like he was drowning, gasping for air but unable to reach the surface. But there is hope, Padre Pio said, his voice softening, filled with compassion. You are never beyond redemption. You must fight. You must confront the darkness within you. You must turn to God, to His mercy, and trust that He will help you overcome. James felt a flicker of hope. Was this really possible? Could he be free? But understand this, Padre Pio warned, his tone becoming more urgent. The longer you wait, the harder it will become. The enemy will tighten his grip on you. Do not wait until it is too late. The doors to hell are open, but God has already made a way out. You must choose which path you will take. The video ended, leaving James in stunned silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't just a faint hope. It was a desire for change. For the first time, he understood the true depth of the battle he was facing. He was not just fighting a bad habit or a fleeting temptation. He was fighting for his very soul. James sat there for a long time, the words of Padre Pio echoing in his mind. He realized that he had been deceived. He had believed the lie that this sin was just a mistake, something that could be brushed aside with a few prayers and good intentions. But now he saw the truth. This was a matter of life and death. Not just physical life, but eternal life. That moment he made a decision. He would fight. He would turn to God with all his heart and ask for the strength to overcome. He would confess, not just to the priest, but to God himself. And he would make it his mission to free himself from this spiritual prison, no matter what it took. But he also knew that this battle would not be easy. It would require more than just willpower. It would require grace and the courage to face the truth about himself. He would need to fight every day, and he would need the strength of God to do it. But for the first time in a long time, James felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. What do you think? Have you ever faced a temptation so powerful that it felt like a battle for your soul? Share your thoughts below. Let's talk about this journey together. If you want to join James in the fight for freedom and redemption, hit that subscribe button now. Don't wait until it's too late. The path to victory begins now. James sat on the edge of his bed, hands trembling as he stared at the cold, lifeless screen of his phone. The words from Padre Pio still echoed in his mind. You are not just making a mistake. You are making a pact with darkness. And the longer you allow it, the more it will consume you. He had heard those words 100 times before, but now they had a weight he couldn't ignore. For the first time, He truly understood what he was up against. In the past, James had tried to brush it all off. He told himself that his struggles weren't a big deal, that everyone faced temptation from time to time. But now, those excuses seemed hollow. They rang false in his ears. His heart had hardened to the reality of the situation, and his mind had convinced him that what he was doing was normal, just part of life. But in this quiet moment, the truth was undeniable. This wasn't normal. It was something far more dangerous, far more insidious. James knew the gravity of what he was facing. He had been deceived by the lies of the world, and in the process, he had allowed a dark power to take root in his soul. He wasn't just dealing with a bad habit or a fleeting temptation. No, this was something far worse. This was a demonic force, a spiritual battle that threatened not only his happiness, but his very soul. It had started so innocently, hadn't it? At first, it was just a curiosity, something he thought he could control. But slowly, little by little, it had crept into every corner of his life, polluting his thoughts, his actions, and even his relationships. The shame, the guilt, the unrelenting urge to keep returning to the darkness. It was all becoming too much to bear. He couldn't escape it. Now, as he reflected on the past months, maybe even years, he saw just how far he had fallen. He had once been close to God, praying regularly, attending Mass, and even teaching his children about faith. But now, he felt so far removed from that life. The man he had once been, confident, at peace, spiritually grounded, felt like a stranger. He was consumed by a constant internal battle, the constant pull of the addiction dragging him further and further away from the man he knew he was meant to be. The truth was stark and undeniable. What he was facing wasn't just a personal failing, it was a spiritual war. Every time he gave in to temptation, every time he allowed the darkness to invade his mind, he was surrendering more and more of his soul to an unseen enemy. And the worst part was that, until now, he hadn't even realized it. But in this moment, sitting alone in his room, James had the clarity he desperately needed. He could no longer pretend that everything was fine. He could no longer convince himself that he was in control. He wasn't. He had been deceived, and the cost of that deception was now clear. It was a battle for his soul, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The idea of a spiritual prison that Padre Pio had spoken of now seemed all too real. James felt the weight of the chains, invisible yet unbreakable. But for the first time, he understood that he could break free. This wasn't just about stopping a harmful behavior, it was about facing the darkness head-on and demanding his freedom back. It was about reclaiming his identity in Christ and taking back control of his life from the forces that had been pulling him under. This realization came with a profound sense of urgency. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. Every moment he allowed this sin to fester. Every day he told himself it was just a phase. He was getting closer to a point of no return. There were no guarantees. He knew that if he didn't act now, the consequences would be far worse than he could ever imagine. He had been living in a lie, and now, for the first time in years, the truth was finally shining through. But even in this moment of awakening, James couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of helplessness. How could he break free from something so deeply ingrained in his life? How could he undo the damage he had done to his own soul? And perhaps most importantly, how could he stand before God after all of this? The fear of facing his own shortcomings, the fear of the judgment that might come was almost too much to bear. But he knew that in the face of truth, there was no other option but to face the consequences and seek redemption. This was the only way forward. He realized that he had been given a gift, the gift of awareness. Many others never make it this far. They continue to live in the dark, trapped in their addiction, unaware of the depths to which it is dragging them. But James knew that this was his moment. This was the beginning of his journey back to God, a journey that would require courage, humility, and above all, the willingness to surrender his life back to Christ. It was not going to be easy. He knew that the road ahead would be long, filled with moments of doubt and temptation. But now, he had a clarity he had never had before. He had faced the truth, and now, armed with that truth, he could fight back. He could reclaim his freedom. He could rebuild his relationship with his wife, his children, and most importantly, with God. The path ahead was clear. He needed to turn to God with all his heart, not just in prayer, but in action. He needed to confront his addiction, seek help, and be held accountable by others who could walk this journey with him. He needed to surrender completely to God's will, trusting that he would provide the strength James so desperately needed. The first step was clear. James knew he had to confess. Not just to a priest, but to God himself. He needed to lay down his burdens, ask for forgiveness, and begin the process of healing. But there was one thing that gave him hope: the love and mercy of God. No matter how far he had fallen, no matter how dark things had become, he knew that God was always waiting with open arms, ready to forgive, ready to heal, ready to restore him to the man he was meant to be. As James knelt down in prayer, the weight of his sins still heavy on his heart, he whispered a simple prayer: "Lord, I am sorry. Please help me. I can't do this on my own." And in that moment, he felt the faintest glimmer of peace, a sign that the battle had already begun to shift. He was not alone. God was with him. And no matter how difficult the journey, James knew that with God's help, he would overcome. James had come to a point where he couldn't stand the life he was living anymore. The chains of addiction had become too heavy, and the pull of darkness far too strong to ignore. He could no longer deceive himself into thinking that things would get better on their own, or that he could just quit whenever he felt like it. No, this had escalated into something much more serious. The lies had piled up, the excuses had faded away, and all he was left with was the cold, brutal reality of his situation. But it wasn't until James discovered a deeper truth within himself, through the teachings of the Bible and the powerful counsel of Padre Pio, that he realized he couldn't rely on his own strength. It wasn't just a matter of willpower or determination. He needed the grace of God, the strength of the Holy Spirit, to guide him out of the destruction he had found himself in. And it was then, at the lowest point, that James made a radical decision. He would take extreme measures to escape the grip of sin and reclaim the life he was meant to live. The first step in this drastic journey was confession. For so long, James had allowed shame to rule his actions, hiding in the darkness and pretending that he could manage it on his own. He thought that if he kept it hidden, it would eventually go away. But through the wisdom of Padre Pio and the clarity of God's word, James realized that the only way out was through humility, a humility that led him to take the courageous step of confession. Every week, he made it a non-negotiable part of his routine. He didn't just go once and hope for the best. No, James committed to a weekly confession, laying his sins bare before God, trusting that his mercy would wash over him. The shame that had once held him captive no longer had power over him, because James understood that grace was the antidote to guilt. But confession wasn't the only step he took. James had learned the hard way that the devil operates through the subtle. The little compromises, the small temptations that seem harmless at first, but gradually pull you deeper into the abyss. So, in order to protect himself from falling back into the same traps, James took drastic action to block all sources of temptation. It wasn't enough to just say no when the temptation arose. He knew that his past struggles had taught him one critical truth: he could not afford to be complacent. That's why he made the decision to block every avenue that had ever led him astray. Social media, websites, and anything that could even remotely pull him back into the cycle of addiction. He deleted apps, installed blockers on his devices, and committed to staying away from environments or situations that might trigger those dangerous thoughts. For James, this wasn't just about controlling his actions. It was about transforming his environment so that he could live in freedom. He understood that temptation thrives in places of weakness, and if he didn't make it harder for himself to fall, then he would be setting himself up for failure. It was a life or death decision, one that he had to make in order to save his soul. Every single day he reinforced this commitment, reminding himself that his soul was worth more than any fleeting pleasure or moment of satisfaction that this world had to offer. The next step James took was rooted in the power of prayer. No longer did he rely solely on his own efforts or sheer willpower. Instead, he turned to God with sincerity and urgency. He realized that this wasn't just a battle of the flesh, it was a spiritual war. So, James committed himself to a deep, consistent prayer life. He set aside time each day to pray, not just out of obligation, but out of a desperate need for God's help. Through prayer, he sought to fortify his mind and soul, calling on the power of God's Holy Spirit to cleanse him from the inside out. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the thoughts still came, when the urge to return to the addiction seemed overwhelming. But James understood that prayer was his lifeline, the one thing that could help him remain steadfast. Along with prayer, James also adopted the practice of fasting. Fasting wasn't just about food, it was a way to discipline his body and mind. It was an act of self-denial, a way to remind himself that his desires didn't control him, but that he was in control through the power of God. During his fasts, James focused on breaking the strongholds that pornography had placed in his mind. He didn't allow himself to indulge in distractions or comforts. He knew that he needed to be fully present with God, seeking his presence and strength to overcome the temptations that still sought to invade his life. Every moment of discomfort during his fasts became a reminder of how important this battle was and how much he needed God's help to emerge victorious. But it wasn't just about what James was doing privately. He knew that his victory over this sin would also depend on community and accountability. He couldn't do this alone. He had to open up and expose the darkness to the light. So, James began to share his story with others, close friends, fellow believers, and even men in his church who had struggled with similar issues. It wasn't easy. Admitting his failure was humbling, and the vulnerability felt terrifying at times. But James knew that this was a crucial part of his healing. By exposing the truth, he was breaking the chains that held him. He wasn't hiding anymore, and more importantly, he wasn't allowing the enemy to keep him isolated. Isolation had been one of the devil's greatest weapons, but now, with others standing by him, James found strength in unity. Through this openness, he was able to help others as well. He didn't just share his experience for sympathy or attention. No, he began to speak out about the dangers of pornography, warning other men about the true consequences of this destructive habit. He wanted others to understand that this wasn't just a harmless indulgence, it was a spiritual trap that could ruin lives. By speaking out, James not only found healing for himself, but also began to offer hope to others who were caught in the same destructive cycle. James's transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a journey, a difficult, painful, and often messy journey, but it was a journey of freedom. Every step he took toward healing, every prayer, every act of surrender, was a step toward breaking the chains of addiction. Through confession, prayer, fasting, and accountability, James found the courage to face his darkest fears and confront the sin that had almost consumed him. Today, James is a different man. He doesn't claim to be perfect, but he knows that he is free. He has experienced the transforming power of God's grace, and he continues to walk in that freedom each day. James's story isn't just a tale of overcoming addiction, it's a testimony to the power of God's mercy and the strength of his love. No matter how deep the sin, no matter how far one has fallen, God's love is always greater, and his power to redeem is always available to those who seek it. Have you ever faced an addiction or struggle that seemed impossible to overcome? What steps have you taken to break free from the chains that bind you? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're ready to take the next step toward freedom, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. For more inspiring content and helpful tips on how to live a life full of purpose, peace, and victory. Together, we can overcome anything, one step at a time. James had reached the turning point he had longed for. The chains that had once held him captive for so many years were no longer there. It wasn't an instant change. There had been moments of doubt, moments when the darkness tried to creep back in. But the decision he had made to break free from the powerful grip of pornography was one he would never regret, and what followed was nothing short of transformative. The first thing James noticed was the immense peace that began to flood his mind and soul. It was as if a storm that had raged for years had suddenly quieted. No longer did he wake up feeling the crushing weight of guilt, that constant voice in the back of his mind telling him he wasn't good enough, telling him that he was doomed. The shame that had once kept him isolated, kept him from seeking help or opening up, had no place in his life anymore. Through the process of surrendering to God's grace, James found an unparalleled peace that washed over him. He could think clearly. He could focus. He could hear God's voice in the stillness of his soul. This peace wasn't fleeting. It was deep and lasting, anchored in the love and mercy of God. But the peace didn't just end with his personal sense of freedom. It began to spill over into his relationships. James's marriage, once strained by the invisible force of his addiction, began to heal. The walls of distance and mistrust slowly came down, brick by brick. He started to spend more time with his wife, engaging with her emotionally and spiritually, not just physically. They had been through so much, and yet now, James could see her clearly. Not as a source of distraction or as a tool for his own selfish pleasure, but as a woman, as a daughter of God. He began to value her in a way he never had before. His eyes were no longer clouded by lust. Instead, they were filled with love and respect. His connection with her deepened, and their bond grew stronger. It wasn't perfect. Relationships take work. But the foundation was no longer built on lies or deceit. It was built on trust, on vulnerability, and on shared faith. This restoration extended beyond his marriage. James's faith came back to life. Before his battle with pornography, he had distanced himself from God, thinking that his sin was too much for God to forgive. But now, after months of confession, prayer, and seeking God's face, he realized the truth. God's grace is sufficient. There was no sin too great that could separate him from God's love. As James leaned into his relationship with God, his spiritual life began to flourish. He started attending Mass regularly again, not just out of obligation, but out of love and a desire to grow closer to God. His heart, once hardened by guilt, was softened by the power of God's mercy. He could feel his presence in a way he hadn't felt in years, and it was this renewed connection with God that kept him grounded in his journey. But it wasn't just about his relationship with his wife or with God. James's perspective on life itself had shifted. Before, he had viewed women through the distorted lens of pornography, a lens that reduced them to objects, to tools for his own gratification. But now, his view of women was radically transformed. He began to see them as daughters of God, each one carrying a unique beauty, a worth that wasn't defined by their appearance or what they could offer. This shift in mindset brought a deep respect for women that wasn't just about avoiding lustful thoughts, but about honoring them as individuals created in the image of God. He began to treat every woman he encountered, whether in his personal life or in passing, with the dignity and respect they deserved. He no longer objectified them or allowed his mind to wander to places it shouldn't go. Instead, he saw them for who they truly were, sacred, cherished, and deserving of love and respect. James's transformation wasn't just internal, it had a ripple effect on everything around him. His actions, his behavior, his choices, all began to align with the new vision he had for his life. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he knew that he was walking in the right direction. The struggle with pornography had almost cost him everything: his marriage, his faith, his self-respect. But by God's grace, he had found a way out. He had found freedom, and it was the most powerful feeling he had ever known. And so, James began to speak out. He knew that there were other men and women who were stuck in the same cycle he had been in, addicted, ashamed, and feeling as if there was no way out. He couldn't keep his story to himself anymore. He wanted to share it with the world, to tell people that there is hope, that there is a way to break free. Pornography almost destroyed me, he would say, but God rescued me, and He can rescue you too. His message wasn't just one of warning, it was one of hope. It was a message that said, No matter how far you've fallen, no matter how deep into sin you've gone, God's love is greater and His redemption is always available. James would speak to groups, sharing his testimony with anyone who would listen. He would talk about the consequences of pornography, not just physically or emotionally, but spiritually. He wanted others to know the truth that he had learned the hard way, that pornography isn't just a harmless habit, but a serious chain that can destroy relationships, diminish self-worth, and sever the connection with God. But most importantly, he wanted people to know that freedom was possible, and it came through God's grace and the willingness to make radical changes in one's life. Looking back, James couldn't believe how far he had come. From the depths of addiction to the heights of freedom, he could see God's hand guiding him every step of the way. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was worth it. Today, James stands as a living testament to the power of God's redemption, knowing that his past does not define him and his future is full of hope. So, if you find yourself in the midst of the same struggle that James once faced, know this: you are not alone. Freedom is possible. Through confession, prayer, accountability, and the grace of God, you can overcome any addiction. The road may be long and the journey may be difficult, but there is always hope. And if you're ready to take that first step to break free from the chains that bind you, know that God is waiting with open arms, ready to embrace you and lead you into the life you were meant to live. We've journeyed together through a powerful, transformative story of struggle, realization, and ultimately, redemption. This journey wasn't just about one man's battle with a destructive addiction. It's about the very real, very present challenges that many of us face in our daily lives. It's about the consequences of making choices that at first seem harmless or even justifiable, but quickly spiral into something much greater, something that has the potential to destroy not only our peace of mind, but our relationships, our faith, and our very lives. Throughout James's story, we've seen a reflection of what can happen when we allow ourselves to be deceived by the illusion of harmless indulgences. It starts with one small choice, one moment of weakness, one step in the wrong direction. But then, as James discovered, that small step can snowball into a habit, a dependency, and eventually a life-altering addiction. He had to fight his way out to confront the truth about what was happening in his life, and most importantly, to accept the fact that his battle was not just physical or mental, it was spiritual. And the longer he stayed trapped in that cycle of shame and guilt, the further he drifted from the person he was meant to be. But as we learned, even in the darkest moments, there is always hope. James's story is a testament to the power of God's grace, the strength of a person's will to change, and the radical, life-altering transformation that can happen when you're ready to confront your demons and take the necessary steps to heal. He found his freedom not in trying to control his addiction on his own, but by surrendering his life, his struggle, and his brokenness to God, who in turn offered him the ultimate gift of grace, mercy, and healing. This isn't just a story for James, it's a story for anyone who feels trapped by their own choices. If you've ever felt the crushing weight of guilt, shame, or addiction, James's journey is proof that change is possible. You can overcome your struggles and find freedom, but you need to be willing to take that first step, to confront the truth, and to commit yourself to the process of healing, just as James did. So let me ask you, how can you apply what we've talked about today to your own life? Maybe it's not pornography you're dealing with. Maybe it's something else: anger, bitterness, doubt, fear, or a different kind of addiction. Whatever it may be, the principle remains the same. You are not alone, and freedom is within your reach. All it takes is the willingness to change, the courage to seek help, and the commitment to live a life that honors God and reflects the best version of yourself. As we wrap up this video, I want to invite you to continue exploring these topics with us. If you found strength, hope, or inspiration in James's story, then there's so much more waiting for you. We have a whole playlist dedicated to stories just like this, stories of struggle, redemption, and transformation. Each video is designed to inspire and empower you to take the next step in your own journey of healing, renewal, and spiritual growth. So if you're ready to dive deeper into how to live a life free from the chains of addiction, brokenness, and shame, then I encourage you to click the link in the description and check out the playlist we've put together for you. Each video is packed with powerful messages and practical steps to help you on your journey. Don't wait for change to come to you. Take action now and start watching videos that will help you break free from the things that hold you back. And before you go, I want to hear from you. What did you think of today's story? Can you relate to James's struggle? Maybe you've experienced a similar battle, or perhaps you're still fighting your own fight. Whatever your story is, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know how this video impacted you. Did it resonate with your own experiences? Did it give you hope or inspiration? Share your story, and let's support one another in this journey toward healing and freedom. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on more life-changing content. Together, we can build a community of people who are passionate about overcoming struggles, embracing change, and living a life that's truly free. Thank you for being part of this conversation. Your story matters, and we are here to walk alongside you as you navigate the path to healing and transformation. Stay strong, stay committed, and remember that freedom is always within reach. Questions for you. What's one step you can take today to begin your own journey of healing and transformation? How has your perspective on the struggle with addiction, shame, or guilt changed after hearing James's story? Have you ever felt trapped by something that seemed small at first, but then spiraled out of control? What did you learn from that experience? Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and let's continue this conversation. And if you found this video helpful, be sure to share it with someone who might benefit from hearing this story.